Margaret Ann Colwell tore the letter in half on the platform, then tore it again, and kept tearing until the pieces were too small to hold. 4 days. She had waited 4 days in Millhaven, Dakota Territory, with $14, one trunk, and a name she didn't recognize anymore. Her own. The station master had stopped pretending not to stare. The women across the street had stopped pretending to look away. And the man who had promised to meet her, Samuel Rourke, horse rancher, letter writer, future husband, was nowhere. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with Margaret all the way to the end. You will not want to leave early. I promise you that. The pieces of the letter scattered off the edge of the platform, and the May wind took them west, which felt about right. Everything in Margaret Colwell's life had been heading west lately. Her money, her dignity, her certainty that she had made a reasonable decision. The wind could have the letter. She was done with it. She sat back down on her trunk and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. 4 days. She had arrived on the morning stage from Yankton on a Tuesday, wearing her good gray dress and carrying herself the way her mother had taught her. Chin up, shoulders back, eyes forward, as if the world owed you nothing and you expected nothing, which was the safest way to move through it. She had stood on this platform and watched every man who came near, looking for the one who matched the description in his letters. Tall, dark hair, a way of standing that took up more space than most men, he'd written, which she had thought was an odd thing to say about yourself, but which she had come to understand meant he was simply honest about what he was. No one had matched the description. By Wednesday, she had asked the station master, a thin man named Gerald Pratt, whether anyone had come through asking for a woman from Cincinnati. "Can't say that anyone has, miss," Gerald had told her, with the particular gentleness people used when they felt sorry for you, but didn't want to be involved. By Thursday, she had moved from the hotel, $1.50 a night, which was criminal, to a rooming house run by a widow named Mrs. Ida Fitch, who charged 75 cents and asked no questions, which Margaret appreciated, even as she understood that the lack of questions meant Mrs. Fitch had already answered them herself. By Friday morning, which was this morning, Margaret had $14.30 remaining from the 22 she had started with. She had a ticket stub from the Yankton stage that was worth nothing. She had one trunk containing everything she owned in the world, which had felt like plenty when she packed it in Cincinnati 4 weeks ago, and felt like a cruel joke now. And she had half a mind to burn the rest of Samuel Rourke's letters, except that she had already burned the first 4 in the small stove in Mrs. Fitch's room last night, and the remaining 8 were currently in her coat pocket, because some part of her that she was deeply ashamed of still wanted to read them again. "Miss Colwell." She looked up. Gerald Pratt was standing at the edge of the platform, with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles. He had the look of a man who had drawn the short straw. "The afternoon stage east comes through at 2 o'clock, he said. "Goes back through Yankton, connects to Sioux Falls, and from there you can get a train north to—" "I know where the stage goes, Mr. Pratt." "Yes, ma'am." He kept turning the hat. "I only mention it because, well, it might be worth considering your options." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No, ma'am. I'm not saying that." "Then what are you saying?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm saying that a woman in your situation, waiting on a platform for 4 days, it draws attention. And attention in a town like Millhaven, it can take on a life of its own. I wouldn't want anyone saying anything unkind about your character." "My character," Margaret repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Pratt." She kept her voice even. She had kept her voice even for 4 days, and she was very tired of it. "I came here to meet a man who promised to meet me. I haven't heard from him. I don't yet know whether he's dead, injured, delayed, or simply a liar. Until I know which of those things is true, I intend to remain exactly where I am. If the people of Millhaven find that scandalous, they are welcome to look somewhere else." Gerald Pratt put his hat back on his head. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, differently this time, and walked back inside. Margaret turned back to the street and watched a wagon roll past, loaded with lumber. The driver glanced at her. She held his gaze until he looked away first. She had been doing that for 4 days, too, holding gazes until people looked away. It was the only territory she had left. The morning wore on. She did not cry. She had cried exactly once, on Wednesday night, alone in Mrs. Fitch's room with the lamp turned down low and her face pressed into the pillow so no one would hear. She had allowed herself 20 minutes of it, the specific grief of a woman who had made a brave decision and watched it fall apart. And then she had washed her face, braided her hair, and gone to sleep. That was all the weeping she was going to do over Samuel O'Rourke. The problem was that she had believed him. That was the part that kept scraping against the inside of her chest, like a piece of broken glass. Not the inconvenience, not even the money, though the money was serious. It was that she had read those letters with the same careful attention she had given to medical texts and patient records, looking for the places where the language turned soft or evasive or falsely grand, the places where a man tried to be more than he was. She had found none of them. His first letter had arrived 3 months after she placed her own notice in the matrimonial papers. Margaret Ann Colwell, 26, widow, trained in practical medicine, seeks honest work and honest partnership in the Western Territories. No romantics need apply. That last line had been Margaret's way of filtering out a certain kind of man. She had received 11 responses anyway, from men who clearly had not understood what "no romantics" meant. Samuel Rourke had been the 12th. "Miss Colwell," he had written, "I am not a romantic man. I run a horse ranch in Dakota Territory, and I work from before sunrise until after dark most days of the year. My first wife died 6 years ago in childbed. I have a younger brother who is more trouble than he is worth, and a piece of land I intend to hold on to no matter what it takes. I am not writing because I am lonely, though I am. I am writing because I read your notice 3 times and thought you sounded like someone who meant what she said. I mean what I say, too. If that is worth anything to you, write back." She had written back. Over the following 8 weeks, they had exchanged 14 letters. He had told her about the ranch, 200 acres of good grassland, a herd of 30 breeding mares, a house he had built himself from cottonwood and riverstone. He had told her about the brother, Brendan, 24 and reckless with other people's patience. He had told her, carefully and without self-pity, about his wife, a woman named Catherine who had wanted nothing more than to be a mother and had died trying to become one. "I don't talk about her to be mournful," he had written. "I talk about her because she was real and she deserved to be remembered. I'd want someone to do the same for me if it came to that." Margaret had told him about Daniel, her own husband, dead 14 months now from a factory fire that had taken 6 men and left her with his debts and his brother Edmund's accusations. She had told Samuel what Edmund had said about her, that she had married Daniel for his small inheritance, that she had known about the debts and hidden them, that she was a cold, scheming woman dressed up as a capable one. "None of that is true," she had written. "I didn't think it was," Samuel had written back. "A scheming woman doesn't advertise that she wants honest partnership. She just looks pretty and waits." That letter she had read more than once. He had sent money for the stage ticket and told her he would meet her at the Millhaven station on the 15th of May. He would be wearing a dark coat and carrying a white handkerchief in his left hand. "I don't hold with flowers," he had written. "They die in the saddlebag." And they would talk face to face before anything else was decided. She had liked that. No presumption, just a conversation. The 15th had come and gone. Now it was the 19th, and Margaret was sitting on her trunk on the platform at Mill Haven, watching the street and trying to decide between two equally unpleasant choices. Leave now and accept that she had been made a fool of, or stay another day and confirm it to everyone watching. "You're still here." The voice came from behind her. She turned. A woman stood at the top of the platform steps, broad-shouldered, 60s, wearing a practical dark dress and an expression that suggested she had seen everything and been surprised by very little of it. She had gray hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of creek water, sharp and assessing. "I'm still here," Margaret agreed. "Helen Cross." The woman descended the steps and stopped in front of her, looking her over the way a person looked over a horse they were considering buying. Not unkindly, but honestly. "I run the apothecary on Front Street. I've been watching you from my window for 3 days." "Have you?" "Don't take that as criticism. I watch everything from my window. It's how I know what's happening in this town before anyone tells me." Helen Cross tilted her head slightly. "You're the woman who was supposed to marry Samuel Rourke." Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her throat. "I was supposed to meet him. Whether we were going to marry depended on the meeting." "Reasonable." Helen looked at her for another moment. "He's not a man who makes promises he doesn't keep." "So everyone seems to believe." Margaret heard the edge in her own voice and didn't bother softening it. "And yet here I am." "Yes." Helen Cross sat down on the platform bench beside Margaret's trunk without being invited, which Margaret found she didn't mind. There was something refreshingly direct about it. "Here's what I know. Samuel Rourke sent his brother Brendan to Deadwood 3 weeks ago to pick up a bill of sale for a new stallion. Brendan Rourke got himself into a card game at the No. 10 Saloon and lost most of his brother's cash money. Then wired Samuel for more. Then disappeared for 5 days. Then turned up again with a cracked rib and a story about a misunderstanding." Margaret stared at her. "How do you know all that?" "Because Brendan Rourke came through my apothecary last Tuesday looking for something for his ribs and couldn't pay for it. So I gave it to him anyway, and he talked for 40 minutes straight, the way men do when they feel guilty and don't know how to say so directly." Helen folded her hands in her lap. "Samuel's been trying to get here. He's had to send someone else to bring the stallion back while he rides himself. The road from his ranch is about 60 miles. There was flooding on the Moreau River last week." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've been sitting on that platform for 4 days, with your back straight and your chin up, and you haven't complained to a single person, and you haven't begged Gerald Pratt for anything. And that's the kind of woman this territory needs." Helen Cross stood up. "And because Samuel Rourke is a decent man, who doesn't deserve to arrive and find you gone. I have a room above the apothecary. Clean sheets, real coffee, and no one will bother you. You can stay until he gets here." "And if he doesn't get here?" Helen looked at her with those creek water eyes. "Then you and I will have a different conversation about your options. But I don't think it'll come to that." She paused. "You got a medical background. You notice said something about practical medicine?" "I worked the civilian ward at Cincinnati General for 2 years during the war, and with my father before that. He was a physician. I've been the closest thing to a doctor in this town for 11 years, and my knees are giving out." Helen said it without complaint, simply as fact. "Come have coffee. Bring your trunk. Gerald!" She raised her voice toward the station door without turning her head. "Get out here and carry this woman's trunk." Gerald Pratt appeared in the doorway, looking startled. "It's not heavy," Margaret said automatically. "It's the principle. Helen said. Margaret picked up her coat and her bag and followed Helen Cross down the platform steps and along Front Street, past the hardware store and the dry goods, and the saloon that was already making noise at 11 in the morning. And she did not look back at the platform where she had spent 4 days of her life, because looking back was a habit she was trying to break. The apothecary smelled of dried herbs and linseed oil, and something sharper underneath. Carbolic, maybe, or camphor. The front room held shelves of brown glass bottles, and a wooden counter worn smooth by years of elbows. A door in the back led to a small workroom, and a narrow staircase in the corner went up. Helen put the coffee pot on the stove without ceremony. "He wrote to you 14 times, Helen said, not a question. "Yes. And you wrote back?" "Yes. What did you think of him? From the letters?" Margaret sat down at the workroom table, which was the kind of table that had been used for a long time for serious purposes. "I thought he was honest. I thought he said difficult things directly instead of softening them. I thought he was—" She stopped. "Lonely," Helen said. "Yes. He's been alone 6 years. Built that ranch from almost nothing after Catherine died. Works himself half to death every season." Helen poured 2 cups and set one in front of Margaret. "He's not a man who asks for things. Writing those letters was probably the hardest thing he'd done in years." Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup. "Then why didn't he write when he was delayed?" "He did." Helen reached into her apron pocket and set an envelope on the table between them. "This came to the station 3 days ago. Gerald put it in his desk because he wasn't sure what to do with it, which is typical of Gerald. I retrieved it this morning." Margaret looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a hand she recognized. The careful, deliberate script of a man who wrote slowly and meant every word. She picked it up. "Miss Caldwell," it read, "I am delayed through no choice of my own. My brother created a situation that required my attention, and the road south has been flooded since last Tuesday. I am riding as fast as I can come. I would not blame you for leaving. I am asking you not to. I will be there. S. Rourke." It was not a long letter. It was not a pretty one. There were no apologies wrapped in flowers and no promises dressed up to look better than they were. It was just a man telling her the truth and asking her to wait. Margaret set the letter down and looked at it for a long moment. "Gerald had this for 3 days," she said quietly. "Gerald is afraid of difficult situations," Helen said. "Most people are." Margaret thought about the 4 mornings she had gotten up and put on her good gray dress and gone back to that platform. She thought about the way she had torn that letter into pieces an hour ago. The letter she had written herself. The one she'd meant to leave on the bench for anyone who happened to be curious. Explaining that she had gone back to Cincinnati and wished Millhaven well. She thought about the pieces of it blowing west. "He could still not come," she said. "He could. I'd be sitting in your spare room, waiting on a man who already let me down once. You'd be sitting in my spare room, using your medical knowledge to help me sort through 3 months of patient notes I haven't had time to file. And incidentally, waiting on a man who wrote you a letter." Helen drank her coffee. "Different thing." Margaret almost smiled. It surprised her. She was still not smiling 2 hours later when she heard boots on the front steps of the apothecary. Heavy, uneven boots. The walk of a man who had been riding for a long time and whose body had forgotten how to move on flat ground. She was standing at Helen's workroom table with a patient ledger open in front of her, and when the door opened, she did not look up immediately, because she had trained herself in 4 days not to look up immediately at every sound, and old habits died hard, even when you wanted them to. "Helen," said a voice, low, rougher than the letters had suggested, and tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night's sleep. I need to speak to you." "You need to speak to someone else," Helen said from behind the counter. "She's in the back." A pause, then footsteps. Margaret looked up. He was tall. The letters had mentioned that, but letters could not fully convey what tall meant when it filled a doorway. Not just height, but the weight of a man who had spent years doing physical work. The breadth of shoulders that had lifted and pulled and carried. His dark hair had more gray in it than she had expected, threading through at the temples and along the jaw where he hadn't shaved in at least 3 days. His coat was covered in dried mud. His left hand, hanging at his side, held a white handkerchief that was no longer particularly white. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Rourke." She closed the patient ledger. "You're 4 days late." "I know." He did not look away. His eyes were dark, very steady, and he had the expression of a man who had been bracing himself for something and was trying to read whether it was coming. "I sent a letter. I received it 2 hours ago. Gerald Pratt had it in his desk." Something moved across his face. Anger, she thought, filed away for later use. "I also sent a telegram from Deadwood on the 15th. "I didn't receive a telegram." "I paid for one." His jaw tightened. "I'll be speaking to someone about that." "So will I," Helen called from the front room. Samuel Rourke stepped further into the workroom and stopped at a distance that was respectful and also suggested he wasn't sure what reception he was about to get. He was still holding the handkerchief. It occurred to Margaret that he had been holding it for 60 miles. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me more than that." She said it without anger, just as fact. "You owe me an honest accounting of what happened and why. And then I'll decide whether to hear the rest of what you came here to say." He nodded once. "Fair. Sit down then." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and he set the handkerchief on the table between them. And he told her everything. Brendan and the card game, the flooded road, the 60-mile ride he'd started 2 days ago and hadn't stopped for except to rest the horse. Because he would not let the horse break, even when he wanted to push harder. He told her about the ranch and the problem he hadn't told her about in the letters. Not because he'd meant to hide it, but because he hadn't known until recently how serious it was. A contract he'd signed 2 years ago with a railroad land agent that was now being used to claim grazing rights over 40 acres of his best river pasture. He told her he was fighting it, and that he didn't know yet if he would win. He told her all of it without once looking away from her face. And when he was done, he leaned back in the chair and put his hands flat on the table and said, "I told you in my first letter, I mean what I say. I meant that too. You deserve to know all of it before you decided anything." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "You rode 60 miles to tell me about a land dispute," she said. "I rode 60 miles because I told you I'd be here and I wasn't. And I wanted you to know why." His voice was careful. "The land dispute I told you because it affects you too if you're going to be there. You should know what you're walking into. Most men wouldn't tell a woman something like that until after the papers were signed. Most men," he said, "are hoping the woman won't notice until it's too late to leave." Margaret was quiet. Outside, a wagon rolled past on Front Street, and someone called out a greeting to someone else, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary town went on around them. Indifferent to the fact that 2 people were sitting in a back room deciding whether they were going to trust each other. "I have conditions," Margaret said. He nodded. "I expected you might." "I'm not going to be managed. I have medical training and I intend to use it. If there are people in that territory who need help and I can provide it, I will, regardless of whether it's considered appropriate for a rancher's wife." "All right. I will not be kept ignorant of financial or legal matters that affect the property. If you sign something, I see it first. If that contract with the railroad is a problem, I want to know every detail of it." His mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You might be better at it than I am." "I almost certainly am." She said it simply, without arrogance. "My husband Daniel was not a careful reader. I was. I know what bad contracts look like." "Then yes, you'll see everything." "And your brother?" Samuel's expression shifted. "What about him?" "You said he was more trouble than he was worth. I need to know what that means in practice. Because I've had one man in my life whose family cost me more than I could afford, and I won't have another." He was quiet for a moment. "Brendan's not malicious. He's young and he's careless, and he thinks the world will catch him every time he falls, which it has, mostly because I'm the one catching him." His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I'm not going to lie to you about him. He's going to make things harder sometimes. But he's my brother, and I'm not cutting him loose." "I'm not asking you to." Margaret looked at him carefully. "I'm asking you to stop catching him every time he falls. There's a difference." Samuel Rourke looked at her across the workroom table with his mud-stained coat and his worn-out hands, and his white handkerchief sitting between them like a small flag of something. And she watched him think about that. "You're right," he said finally. "That's a harder thing. But you're right." Helen Cross appeared in the doorway, holding 2 more cups of coffee, looked at both of them, set the cups down on the counter, and left without saying a word. "Mr. Rourke," Margaret said. "Samuel." Samuel. The name sat differently than she expected in her mouth. Solid, like the letters had suggested. "I didn't come to Dakota Territory looking for a romantic story. I came because I needed a life that was real. I needed work that mattered, and a partnership that was honest. I had that with Daniel for 8 months before the fire, and it was the only time in my adult life I felt like I was living at full size. I want that again. Not the grief, not the loss, just the full size of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know something about living small," he said quietly. 6 years of it. You get used to taking up only as much space as you need and no more. And after a while, you stop remembering that there was supposed to be more. He picked up the handkerchief, turned it once in his hands, set it down. "I can offer you that. The full size of it. I can't promise it won't be hard." "I don't want promises that it won't be hard," Margaret said. "I want promises that you'll be honest when it is." "That I can do." She thought of the letter in 4 days of pieces blowing west. She thought of the platform where she had held 24 hours worth of stares until people looked away. She thought of Daniel's voice reading to her from his medical books on the nights he couldn't sleep, and the way she had learned to love a person not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small, consistent truths. "All right," she said. He looked at her with something in his eyes that she wasn't ready to name yet, and wasn't going to try. "All right," he said. Outside, Millhaven went about its business. The afternoon stage would come through at 2 o'clock. Margaret Ann Colwell was not going to be on it. Helen did not come back into the workroom for another hour, which Margaret understood was a deliberate kindness. The coffee sat between them, and they drank it, and the conversation that followed was not the kind of conversation that got written about in newspapers or turned into stories, but it was the kind that mattered. The kind where 2 people sit across a table and take each other's measure without flinching. Samuel told her more about the ranch. Not the version from the letters, which had been accurate but curated, the way a man cleaned up a house before company arrived. This was the version underneath, the mare that had gone lame in February and cost him 3 weeks and $40 to bring back sound. The section of fencing along the north pasture that needed replacing before fall but probably wouldn't get done because there weren't enough hours. The fact that the well near the barn had been running slow since March, and he didn't yet know why. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The well could be a root intrusion or a sediment buildup. Either one is fixable if you catch it early." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "My father had a farmhouse outside Cincinnati. The well went slow twice in 10 years. First time was roots. Second time was silt from a wet spring." She set down her cup. "You dig it out or you recase it. Neither one is cheap, but both are better than losing the well entirely." "I'll keep that in mind." He said it without condescension, which she noticed. Some men said things like that to women the way they said it to children, politely, meaning nothing. He said it the way a person wrote something down. They talked for another 20 minutes about practical matters. The distance from the ranch to Millhaven, how often he came in for supplies, whether the road was passable in winter. Margaret asked about the nearest doctor, which was a 2-day ride south, and about what happened when someone on the ranch was injured, which Samuel answered with a directness that confirmed what she had already suspected, that for 6 years, whatever happened on that ranch, he had handled it alone because there was no other choice. "Brendan doesn't help with that," she said, not a question. Samuel's jaw shifted slightly. "Brendan helps with what he's in the mood to help with." "Which is not medical emergencies." "Which is not most things that require sustained attention." He looked at his hands on the table. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds honest." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I've been trying to decide since you walked in whether you were going to be honest about him or whether you were going to manage what you told me the way people manage bad news. Give you the shape of it, but not the weight." She paused. "You gave me the weight. I appreciate that. I told you in my first letter, I'm not going to clean something up to make it easier to swallow." "Most people do." "Most people," he said, "end up with bigger problems later because of it." The front door of the apothecary opened and closed, and they heard Helen's voice in the front room, efficient and brief, speaking to someone buying something for a cough. The ordinary commerce of a small town going about its afternoon. Margaret had spent 4 days feeling invisible in this town, and now she was sitting in the back of its apothecary, making decisions that would change the shape of her life, which was either poetic or ridiculous, and she wasn't sure which. "The contract," she said. "The railroad land claim. I want to see it." Samuel reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which told her he had been carrying it and had intended to show her. She unfolded it on the table and read it straight through without stopping, the way her father had taught her to read anything legal. Once fast for the overall shape, once slow for the places where the language got complicated. The second reading took a while. Samuel waited without speaking, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "This clause here," she said finally, putting her finger on a line in the third paragraph. "This grants right of passage for survey and assessment across any property adjacent to the proposed rail corridor." Do you know what adjacent means in this document? "I thought it meant the land right beside the tracks." "It doesn't. It means within half a mile of the proposed corridor, which, as far as I can tell from the survey marks listed here, includes your river pasture and possibly the southeast corner of your breeding grounds." She looked up at him. "Did the agent explain this to you when you signed it?" A long pause. "No." "Did you have a lawyer look at it?" "There isn't a lawyer in Millhaven. There's one in Deadwood." "It was 2 years ago. I didn't think I needed one." His voice was level, but there was something tight underneath it. "I know. I should have been more careful." "Yes." She said it plainly, without cruelty. "But this clause may not be enforceable if you can show the agent misrepresented the scope of the agreement at the time of signing." That would require a witness to the conversation, or a written record of what was represented to you before you signed. Samuel stared at her. You know contract law. I know what I've read. Daniel worked in manufacturing, and I read everything that came across his desk, because he often didn't. She refolded the document carefully. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to tell you that Victor Aldridge, whoever he is, signed his name to this document as the railroad's representative, which means he's personally liable if he misled you about its terms. Aldridge. Samuel's voice changed on the name, went flat and careful, the way voices did around something dangerous. He was in Millhaven 2 weeks ago. Came to the ranch. Very polite, very pleasant. Told me it was all routine, just confirming survey markers. Did he bring anyone with him? One man, younger, taking notes. Then there's a record somewhere of what was surveyed. Margaret looked at him steadily. You need that Deadwood lawyer, Samuel, before Aldridge comes back. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've been here 4 hours. I've been thinking for 4 days. It gave me time to consider what I was walking into. She pushed the document back across the table to him. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you said I'd see everything, and this is the most important thing to see. He picked up the document and put it back in his coat, and the look on his face was not the look of a man who had been managed or patronized. It was the look of a man recalibrating something. When I sent for a wife, he said slowly, I thought I was looking for someone to share the work. You were. I didn't think about what it might mean to share the thinking. Those are the same thing, Margaret said. If you're only sharing the labor and not the decisions, it's not a partnership. It's just employment with a ring. The corner of his mouth moved. Catherine would have liked you. It was a quiet thing to say, and Margaret understood it was not a small thing. She didn't respond immediately, letting it sit in the air between them the way serious things deserve to sit. Tell me about her, she said. Not to be mournful, because she was real. He told her. Not the version he might have told a stranger or a casual acquaintance, the brief and careful version that kept grief at a manageable distance. The fuller version, the one that lived in the specific details, Catherine's habit of singing while she worked, off-key and completely unbothered about it. The way she had insisted on planting a kitchen garden in their first spring, even though the ground was half rock, and it had produced exactly 4 tomatoes, and she had been triumphant about every single one of them. The morning Samuel had come in from the barn and found her sitting at the table with her hands over her face, not crying, just resting in the dark of her own palms. And when he'd asked what was wrong, she'd said nothing was wrong. She was just thinking about how much she loved him, and it was a lot to hold sometimes. She died on a Tuesday, he said, June 14th. I'd been in the upper pastures since before dawn. By the time I got back, it was over. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I know. He looked at the table. I spent a long time being angry that I wasn't there. Then I spent a long time understanding that being there wouldn't have changed it. Then I spent the rest of the time just carrying it. He looked up. You know about that kind of carrying. Daniel died on a Saturday, she said. I was at the hospital. Someone came to find me. I walked out of a ward in the middle of changing a dressing, and I never went back. She paused. Edmund, his brother, came to the house 3 days after the funeral with a solicitor. Said Daniel had borrowed money from him that was now owed to the estate. Said I had known about it and concealed it. Said a great many things. Were any of them true? None of them. Her voice was steady. I had nothing. The house was rented. The debts were real, just not the ones Edmund invented. I sold everything that was mine to sell, paid what I could, and left Cincinnati with $32 and my father's medical bag. She met his eyes. I placed that notice because I had run out of options and I refused to run out of dignity. I chose the West because, at least out here, no one had already decided what kind of woman I was. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. What kind of woman are you? The kind who reads contracts before she signs them. A pause. The kind who can set a dislocated shoulder and treat a fever and manage a medical ledger and grow 4 tomatoes in bad soil if it comes to that. He almost smiled. It changed his face considerably. Catherine's 4 tomatoes were a point of pride for years. As they should have been. They sat in a silence that had changed quality since the beginning of the conversation, had gone from the careful silence of strangers to something easier, the silence of people who had said enough difficult, true things to each other that the space between words had started to feel comfortable rather than threatening. Then the front door of the apothecary opened with considerably more force than necessary. Helen's voice said sharply, "Brendan Rourke, this is a medical establishment, not a saloon." "Yes, ma'am, I know that. I just need to—" A younger voice, lighter than Samuel's, with the same underlying cadence, but missing the steadiness. "Sam? Are you back here?" Samuel's expression closed like a shutter. He stood up. Brendan Rourke appeared in the workroom doorway and was nothing like his brother in the ways that mattered. He was younger by a decade and a half, and it showed in everything. The way he moved, quick and a little careless. The way his eyes went first to Margaret with unguarded curiosity, before going to Samuel with something more complicated. He had the same dark coloring, the same height, but where Samuel looked like a man who had been tested by years and found sufficient, Brendan looked like a man who was still deciding whether testing was something that applied to him. He had a healing bruise along his left jawline that Margaret, professionally, noted was about 10 days old. "You made it," Brendan said to Samuel. There was relief in it, genuine and unperformed. "I was starting to think the road—" "We'll talk about the road later," Samuel said. His voice was not loud, but it stopped Brendan mid-sentence, the way a hand on a chest stopped forward motion. "Right now, you're going to introduce yourself properly." Brendan blinked, then looked at Margaret, then back at Samuel, then at Margaret again with a dawning comprehension that reorganized his expression into something between sheepish and hopeful. "You're Miss Colwell." "I am," Margaret said. "I'm Brendan." He pulled off his hat, which was the right instinct, even if it was 3 beats late. "I'm real sorry about— the situation with the stage money. That was a misunderstanding, and I know Sam had to—" "Brendan." Samuel's voice was quiet and final. Brendan stopped. "Whatever you came in here to say," Samuel said, "say it, and then give us the room." A flicker of something moved across Brendan's face. Not quite hurt, but adjacent to it. The expression of a younger brother who had long experience of being the problem in the room and had not yet figured out how to stop being it. Margaret watched him and thought about Edmund, who had also been a younger sibling with a talent for creating wreckage, and understood that the comparison was not entirely fair. Edmund had been calculating. Brendan Rourke, she suspected, was something different. Not malicious, just genuinely unfinished. "Aldridge was at the ranch," Brendan said. He said it looking at Samuel, and his voice had changed, the bluster gone, something more serious in its place. "Day before yesterday. Him and 2 other men. They were in the river pasture. I told them they didn't have leave to be there, and one of them showed me a paper." "What kind of paper?" Margaret asked. Brendan looked at her, slightly startled to be addressed directly. "Looked like a survey notice. Official looking. Had the railroad seal on it." "Did you read it?" It was a lot of legal language." "Did you keep it?" He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet which he held out, and Margaret took it before Samuel could, because she was already thinking about what it likely said, and she needed to see if she was right. She unfolded it and read it quickly. She was right. "They're moving the survey," she said. "This notice claims the right to formally assess the river pasture for permanent easement, not just passage. Samuel, this is the next step before they file the full claim. They're trying to establish the easement as a legal fact before you can challenge the original contract." "How long do we have?" Samuel asked. "The notice gives 30 days from the date of service, which," she checked the date, "was 2 days ago. So 28 days. The silence in the workroom had a different quality now. "I need that Deadwood lawyer tomorrow," Samuel said. "Today would be better," Margaret said. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not the careful assessment of the first hour, not the measured honesty of the conversation about Catherine and Daniel, but something more immediate. The look of a man who had been carrying a problem alone for 2 years and had just been handed the specific and practical help of another person who knew what they were doing. "Today," he agreed. Brendan was watching them both with an expression Margaret couldn't fully read. Some mixture of relief and wariness and something else. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding that the dynamic in this room had shifted in a way that would not be shifting back. "Brendan," Samuel said, "go tell Helen we'll need her to send a message to the telegraph office. I need to reach James Whitfield in Deadwood before end of day." "James Whitfield, the lawyer? Do you know another James Whitfield?" "No, but—" Brendan paused. "Sam, the last time you talked to Whitfield, you told me you couldn't afford him." Things have changed. Samuel did not look at Margaret when he said it, but the words carried the clear and unambiguous weight of a man who is no longer solving his problems by himself. Brendan looked from his brother to Margaret and back again. Then something settled in his face. Not acceptance exactly, not yet, but the first tentative movement toward it. He put his hat back on. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, and went back out to the front room. Samuel turned to Margaret. "I know this isn't the arrival you were expecting," he said. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's considerably more complicated." "I should have told you about Aldridge and the letters." "You should have." She held his gaze. "But you're telling me now, and you're not minimizing it. And you've already agreed to let me see everything. That counts for something." She folded the survey notice and held it out to him. "Keep this with the contract. Whitfield will need both." He took it, and for a moment his fingers brushed hers. The briefest contact, unplanned and quickly passed. He stepped back. "We haven't talked about the practical arrangements," he said carefully. For coming to the ranch. What that looks like." "No," she said. "We haven't." "I'm not going to assume anything. Whatever pace makes sense to you." Margaret thought about that platform. About 4 days of watching the road and holding her chin at the angle that meant she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. About the pieces of a letter blowing west, and the way she had felt watching them go. Not grief exactly, but a kind of relief, as if something that had been clenched in her chest had finally let go of its grip. She thought about Helen Cross sitting down beside her without being invited, because that was what capable women did for each other in places where there were too few of them. She thought about a man who had ridden 60 miles with a white handkerchief in his hand, because he had told a woman he would be there, and he intended to be there, even if it killed him. "There's a justice of the peace in Millhaven," she said. Samuel went very still. "I'm not doing this to rush anything," Margaret said. "I'm doing it because if we're going to fight a railroad land claim, I should probably have my name on the deed." She looked at him steadily. "That's the practical reason. There are other reasons too, but those can wait." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Helen told me you were the kind of woman this territory needed." Helen is frequently right. She is. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter and turned it once in his hands. Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed. "We should find that justice of the peace," he said, "before either of us has time to think too carefully about whether this is reasonable." "It isn't reasonable," Margaret said, standing up, "but neither was any of the rest of it." She picked up her coat, and Samuel held the workroom door open, and they walked out into the front room together, where Helen Cross was standing behind her counter, pretending to organize a shelf of brown glass bottles with excessive concentration. "We need a justice of the peace," Margaret said. Helen did not look up from the shelf. "Edgar Marsh, 2 streets north, green door. He'll be home for lunch." A pause. "Brendan already left to send the telegram. I told him to take his time." Margaret looked at her. Helen looked back, and the Creekwater eyes were warm in a way that hadn't been there at the beginning of the afternoon. "Go on then," she said, "before you change your minds." Margaret walked out into the May sunlight of Front Street with Samuel Rourke 1 pace behind her, and the town of Millhaven went about its afternoon around them, entirely unaware that 2 people were walking toward a green door to make a decision that could not be unmade, that had been built from 14 letters and a 60-mile ride, and a white handkerchief, and 4 days of a woman refusing to look away. She did not look back at the apothecary. She was working on that habit. Edgar Marsh turned out to be a small man with large hands and the unhurried demeanor of someone who had married a great many people in a small town and understood that the ceremony itself was rarely the point. He found them at his door during his lunch, as Helen had predicted, and he looked at Samuel, and then at Margaret, and then at Samuel again, with a particular expression of a man who recognized a situation that did not require a great deal of explanation. "Give me 5 minutes," he said, and closed the door. They stood on his porch in the May afternoon and did not speak, which was not uncomfortable, the way silence between strangers was uncomfortable, but rather the way silence was before something that mattered. Full rather than empty, weighted with the specific gravity of a decision already made and now simply being arrived at. Samuel turned his hat in his hands once. Margaret watched the street. "You can still change your mind," he said. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." "I know." She looked at him sideways. "That's why I keep not changing it." Edgar Marsh reappeared with a ledger under his arm and a woman behind him who turned out to be his wife, sturdy and curious, pressed into service as witness with the cheerful willingness of someone who enjoyed being present at consequential moments. The ceremony took 8 minutes. Margaret said her vows in a clear, even voice, looking at Samuel's face, and Samuel said his in the low, deliberate voice of a man who chose his words carefully because he intended to be held to them. When Edgar Marsh pronounced them married, Samuel's wife looked down at the plain ring on her finger. His mother's ring, he had told her, produced from his vest pocket with an expression that suggested he had been carrying it for some time without knowing whether he would need it. And she thought about Daniel's ring, which she had sold in Cincinnati for $11, and 3 months of grief about doing it. This ring was thinner, more worn. It fit. "Congratulations, Mr. Rourke," Edgar Marsh said, shaking Samuel's hand. "Mrs. Rourke," his wife said warmly, taking Margaret's. Margaret had been Mrs. Rourke for approximately 40 seconds, and the name was still doing something strange in the back of her chest. Not wrong, but new in the way that new things were new before they became familiar. They walked back to the apothecary through the afternoon, and Helen looked at the ring on Margaret's finger and at Samuel's face and said nothing except, "The telegram went through. Whitfield will meet you in Deadwood Friday." Then she handed Margaret a paper-wrapped parcel. "For the road. Don't argue with me about it." Margaret did not argue. She was learning when Helen Cross's decisions were negotiable and when they were not. which was a skill she suspected would be useful for a long time. The ride to the ranch took most of the following day. Samuel had a wagon he'd left at the livery, loaded with the supplies he'd intended to bring back before Brendan's trouble had complicated everything. And Margaret's trunk went in the back, alongside sacks of flour and coiled wire and a crate of tools. Brendan appeared at the livery at dawn, with the expression of a man who had spent a night recalibrating and hadn't entirely finished the process. He looked at Margaret, and then at the ring on her hand, and then at Samuel, and something moved across his face that was not resentment exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. The way a person felt when something changed that they had not been consulted about, even when they understood, intellectually, that they had no right to be consulted. "You got married," Brendan said. "We did," Samuel said. A pause. "Yesterday." "Yes." Brendan looked at Margaret. She looked back at him with the same steady gaze she had used on the people of Millhaven who had watched her sit on that platform, which was the gaze of a woman who understood she was being assessed and was doing her own assessing simultaneously and was not going to pretend otherwise. "All right," Brendan said finally, to no one in particular, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. The road north from Millhaven was rough, and the wagon moved slowly over the places where the spring flooding had softened the ground. Samuel drove. Margaret sat beside him, and Brendan rode ahead on his own horse, which suited everyone reasonably well. The Dakota Territory spread around them in every direction, the kind of vast and unsentimental landscape that made a person understand very quickly that it did not care about their problems, and they were going to have to manage accordingly. "Tell me about Whitfield," Margaret said, when they had been on the road an hour. "The lawyer." "Good man. Careful. He handled a land dispute for Tom Greer, who has the cattle ranch south of me. Greer kept his property." Samuel guided the horses around a rut. "He's expensive." "How expensive?" "Expensive enough that I was trying to manage Aldridge without him." "That's why you're in this position." She said it without judgment, just as fact. "What do you have in liquid assets? Not the land, not the horses. Cash." "About $400 in the Deadwood Bank. Whitfield will want at least half of that as a retainer. Possibly more, depending on how complicated the filing is." She watched Brendan's horse moving ahead of them on the road. "Is there anything on the ranch that could be sold quickly if we needed more?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "There's a breeding stallion coming from Deadwood, the one Brendan was supposed to collect. Cost me $200. He's good stock, worth considerably more than that, but I was planning to use him for the breeding program. Could you sell him and buy a lesser stallion to cover this year?" He didn't answer immediately, and she understood that the silence wasn't stubbornness, but the silence of a man doing real arithmetic, not just the money, but what it cost the operation, what it set back, what it meant for the years after. She had watched Daniel do the same kind of thinking and had learned to wait it out. "Yes," he said finally, "if it came to that. It may not, but I want to know what we have before Aldridge pushes further." She paused. "I want to be at the Deadwood meeting." He looked at her. "I've read the contract and the serving notice," she said. "I know what they say better than you do at this point. No offense." "None taken." A beat. "You'll come." The ranch appeared to them late in the afternoon as the road crested a low rise, and Margaret saw it spread below in the valley. The house, built low and solid against the hillside, the barn and corrals, the silver thread of the river through the grass. She had imagined it from the letters, had built a version of it in her mind during the 4 days on the platform when she'd had nothing to do but think about what she was waiting for. And the real version was both smaller and larger than the imagined one, the way actual things always were. "Well," she said. "It's not much to look at from up here," Samuel said. "It's honest," she said. "I can see that from up here." He glanced at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between surprise and the particular satisfaction of a person who had been seen accurately. He did not say anything, which she was also learning was its own form of communication with him. Samuel Rourke said things when he had something to say, and was quiet when he didn't, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. The house was 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, built from cottonwood timber and river stone, the way he had described in his letters. The main room held a fireplace, a cast-iron stove, a table, and 2 wooden chairs that looked like they had been made by someone who prioritized function over comfort. A door on the far wall led to a bedroom that Samuel showed her with the careful, slightly formal manner of a man showing someone a private space and hoping it met a standard he hadn't been entirely sure he could reach. She looked at the room. A bed, a dresser, a window facing east. He had put fresh sheets on the bed, which she suspected had involved considerable effort on his part, and which he did not mention, which told her more about him than mentioning it would have. "It's good," she said. "There's another room that could be, eventually, if you wanted a separate space for medical work. It's being used for storage right now." He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "I can clear it." "Not immediately, but yes." She turned to face him. "Where will you sleep?" "The loft, for now." He said it straightforwardly, no performance of martyrdom about it. "I told you whatever pace makes sense." "I heard you." She met his eyes. "I'm not ready for more than this yet. I want you to know that's about me, not about any failing on your part." "I didn't think otherwise." "Good." She paused. "Some men would." "Some men," he said, with the particular tone he used when he was acknowledging a truth about the general behavior of his gender without excusing it, "aren't worth the trouble they cause." She was unpacking the first of her boxes onto the dresser. Her father's medical bag, the patient ledger she'd started at Helen's, a small photograph of Daniel that she set down and then picked back up and put inside the top drawer, which felt right in a way she couldn't have explained, when she heard voices outside. Samuel's voice, and another voice, a third voice she didn't recognize, harder in register than Brendan's easy cadence. She came out of the bedroom to find Samuel standing at the front door, talking to a man on horseback in the yard. The man was perhaps 45, well-dressed for the territory, with the neat appearance of someone who had a reason to make good impressions, and the money to support the effort. He had a younger man beside him, also mounted, who was writing something in a small book. Victor Aldridge. She had not yet seen him, but she knew it, the way she had known certain things about patients before she had all the information, from the posture, from the particular quality of the attention Samuel was paying him, from the way Samuel's shoulders had gone to the same flat, controlled set they'd had when he was telling her about Brendan and the card game. She walked to the door and stood beside Samuel. Aldridge's eyes moved to her with the smooth, practiced reflex of a man who assessed situations quickly and was good at it. He registered the ring on her hand in approximately 2 seconds, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration, the adjustment a chess player made when his opponent moved differently than expected. "Mr. Rourke," Aldridge said pleasantly, "I didn't realize you'd returned. And this must be—" "My wife," Samuel said. "Margaret Rourke." "Mrs. Rourke." Aldridge touched his hat with the effortless courtesy of a man who used manners the way other men used tools. "Victor Aldridge, Union Pacific Land Acquisitions. A pleasure." "I know who you are," Margaret said. "My husband showed me the contract." A small pause. "Of course. Standard documentation. I hope it was all clear." "It wasn't," Margaret said. "The language in the 3rd paragraph regarding adjacency rights was not explained to my husband at the time of signing in a way consistent with its actual legal scope. We'll be discussing that with our lawyer on Friday." Aldridge's pleasant expression did not change, which meant he was good at this, which meant he had done it many times before. I'm sure any confusion can be cleared up easily. These documents are quite standard. I'm sure they are, Margaret said. And I'm sure James Whitfield will find them very straightforward to examine. This time, something did move across Aldridge's face. James Whitfield was apparently a name that meant something to him, which was useful information. Mr. Rourke, Aldridge said, turning back to Samuel with the instinct of a man who preferred to negotiate with the party he assessed as less informed. I came by simply to let you know the survey team will be completing their assessment of the river pasture this week. Routine work, nothing to concern yourself with. The survey team will wait until after Friday, Samuel said. His voice was quiet, and it was not a request. I'm afraid the schedule will wait, Margaret said. Or we will file an injunction with the territorial court in Yankton before the end of the week, claiming misrepresentation in the original contract. That will halt all survey activity pending review, which could take several months. She held Aldridge's gaze. I imagine the railroad has its own schedules to maintain. The younger man with the notebook had stopped writing. Aldridge looked at Margaret with the first genuinely unguarded expression she had seen on his face, which was the expression of a man who had miscalculated something and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. Friday, he said finally. Of course. We'll coordinate with Mr. Whitfield's office. He touched his hat again. A pleasure, Mrs. Rourke. He turned his horse and rode back up the track toward the road, the younger man falling in beside him, and Margaret watched them go with the same steady attention she had paid to everything that required it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. You threatened him with an injunction, he said. Yes. Can we actually file one? I don't know. That's what Whitfield is for. She turned back into the house. But Aldridge didn't know that I didn't know, which is what mattered. Behind her, she heard Samuel make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in its vicinity. Something released. Something eased. She was learning the geography of his expressions and his silences, and his not-quite laughs. And the learning of it was one of the more interesting things that had happened to her in recent memory. Brendan had watched the whole exchange from the barn door, where he'd been unsaddling his horse. And when Margaret passed him on her way to bring in the rest of the boxes from the wagon, he looked at her with an expression that had shifted since morning. The wariness was still there, but the other thing, the adjacent to resentment thing, had moved. You know about injunctions, he said. I know about a number of things, Margaret said. Sam didn't tell me you were... He paused, looking for the right word. What? Like that. He seemed to be genuinely working something out. In the letters, he said you had medical training, and you'd been widowed, and you came from Cincinnati. He didn't say you were... Another pause. Like that, he repeated, apparently having decided this was sufficient. Like what, Brendan? She stopped and looked at him directly, the same way she had looked at people for 4 days on that platform. Not unkindly, but without flinching. He met her eyes for a moment, then looked away, then looked back. Like someone who's going to be useful. It was not the most eloquent thing she had ever been called, but Margaret thought it might be one of the more honest. Yes, she said, I intend to be. She carried the last 2 boxes inside and set them on the table, and began to think about what the house needed and in what order. The fireplace needed cleaning. She could see that from across the room. The kitchen area had flour and lard and coffee, but the organization of it was the organization of a man who cooked the same 4 things in rotation, and hadn't reconsidered the system in years. The window on the east wall of the main room faced the direction the morning light would come from, and she thought, briefly and without particular sentimentality, about curtains. Not the fancy kind, just something to manage the light. Something that would make the room feel less like a place where a man waited out the seasons, and more like a place where people lived. She would do it eventually. There were more pressing things first. Samuel came inside and set a pot of water on the stove without being asked, which told her he had been thinking about supper, and that his thinking about supper was an instinct turned toward her, toward the fact of another person in his house, who had ridden all day and hadn't complained about it. She found the salt pork in the larder and the dried beans and started them soaking, and they worked around each other in the small kitchen space with the slightly careful choreography of two people who hadn't learned each other's movements yet, but were paying attention. "The river pasture," she said while the water heated. "How much of your operation depends on it?" "The breeding mares use it June through August. Best grass on the property. If Aldridge gets the easement and the railroad puts a work camp through there, the mares can't graze it during the noise and disruption." He set plates on the table. "That's 2 years of breeding stock displaced. Maybe more, depending on how long construction takes." "How many foals does that pasture produce in a season?" 6 to 8 in a good year. At current prices, about $300 a foal if I'm selling trained stock." He looked at her. "You're doing arithmetic." "I'm always doing arithmetic." She stirred the beans. "So the easement could cost you $2,000 or more over the course of the construction, not counting what it does to the breeding program long term." "Yes." "Aldridge knows that." "He knows exactly that. He's been waiting for me to decide it's less trouble to settle than to fight." Samuel sat down in one of the functional chairs with the air of a man whose body was reminding him that he had ridden 60 miles 2 days ago, and then driven a wagon all day today. "Most ranchers in my position settle. They take the payment the railroad offers and try to make up the difference elsewhere." "What does the railroad offer?" $200 and a formal acknowledgement of the disruption. His voice was flat. "That's what Greer got from the next county over. $200 for land that earned him 6 times that in a season." "He took it?" "He had a sick wife and 2 sons, and not enough in the bank to fight." Margaret turned from the stove and looked at Samuel directly. "We have $400 in the bank, a lawyer on Friday, a contract with a misrepresentation clause that Aldridge knows I've identified, and I just told his face that we'll file an injunction if he moves before the meeting." She paused. "We're in a better position than Greer was." "You said you don't know if we can actually file one." "No, but fighting a legal claim is 30% the actual law and 70% whether the other side believes you'll use it. Aldridge believed me." She turned back to the stove. "He'll be more careful until Friday. That's what we needed." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Margaret?" She looked at him. "I've been fighting this alone for 8 months," he said, "making decisions I wasn't sure about and hoping they'd hold, and watching Aldridge come back each time a little more certain I'd fold." He stopped. The firelight was doing things to the planes of his face, finding the exhaustion that was still there under the surface. "I don't feel alone in it anymore." It was a simple thing to say. It was not a small thing. "You're not," she said. Outside, Brendan was bringing the horses into the barn for the night, and the Dakota Territory was settling into the particular deep quiet of a place that was large enough to absorb all human sounds and still have silence left over. The beans were beginning to give up their stiffness. Margaret's father's medical bag sat on the dresser in the bedroom she had not yet slept in. The ring on her finger was warm from the day. She had been Mrs. Rourke for less than 24 hours. She had already faced down the man trying to take her husband's land, organized the kitchen, started supper, and talked a near stranger into trusting her with the full weight of his problems. It was, she thought, a reasonable first day. She did not think about Cincinnati. She did not think about Edmond, or the platform in Millhaven, or the pieces of the letter that had blown west 2 days ago. She thought about Friday and Whitfield and the third paragraph of a railroad contract, and what it was going to take to hold this piece of land against a company with more money than patience. She thought about Catherine Rourke's 4 tomatoes, which had grown in bad soil because someone had refused to accept that the soil was the end of the story. She thought that was probably the right model. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said, and Samuel said, "I'll get Brendan." And the house, for the first time since Catherine had left it 6 years ago, sounded like a place where more than one person lived. James Whitfield turned out to be a broad man in his 50s, with a beard going white at the edges, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who charged by the hour and had learned that patience was its own form of leverage. He met them in his Deadwood office on Friday morning, looked at the contract and the survey notice Margaret laid on his desk, and read both documents without speaking for a full 10 minutes, while Samuel sat in one of the client chairs and Margaret stood at the window, watching the street below, where Deadwood was conducting its usual loud and consequential business. When Whitfield set the documents down, he looked at Margaret rather than Samuel. "Who identified the adjacency clause?" he asked. "I did," Margaret said. "Legal background?" "No, careful reading." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man updating an assessment. "The misrepresentation argument is viable," he said. "Not certain, but viable. The critical question is whether Aldridge verbally represented the scope of the agreement differently than what's written here at the time of signing." He looked at Samuel. "Did he? He told me it was right-of-way access for survey teams," Samuel said. "Passage through the property. He didn't say anything about permanent easement or grazing disruption. Was anyone else present for that conversation?" "Brendan was in the barn. He may have heard part of it. Brendan is your brother and lives on your property, which makes him a less useful witness than we'd like, but not useless." Whitfield picked up his pen. "Here is what I can do. I can file a challenge to the survey notice on the grounds of procedural misrepresentation, which will require the railroad to respond formally before proceeding. That buys time. Simultaneously, I can request the railroad's internal documentation of Aldridge's instructions, what he was authorized to represent to property owners when obtaining signatures. If his representations exceeded his authorization, the railroad itself has a liability problem. Can you get that documentation?" Margaret asked. "I can ask for it in a way that makes refusing it expensive." Whitfield's mouth moved in what might have been a smile on a different face. "The railroad is a large organization. Large organizations have paper trails they'd prefer stayed internal. Sometimes reminding them of that is sufficient." "How long does all of this take?" Samuel asked. "The challenge filing, 2 weeks. The documentation request, potentially 60 days for a response. A full hearing, if it comes to that, could be 6 months to a year." He set down his pen. "Mr. Rourke, I want to be direct with you. The law in the territories is newer than the money backing the railroad. If Aldridge and his employers decide to push this through the courts rather than settle, the cost to you will exceed what you currently have available. I need you to understand that going in." The room was quiet for a moment. Margaret watched Samuel's face go through the same slow internal arithmetic she had seen on the wagon road from Millhaven. Not emotion suppressed, but calculation conducted, the weighing of real things against each other, without the luxury of pretending any of them were lighter than they were. "What are the odds they push it to a full hearing?" she asked Whitfield. "Honestly, less than a third. Aldridge is one of 6 land agents working this territory. If I file a formal challenge and request internal documentation, his superiors are going to ask why this particular property is costing them legal exposure when they have 5 other agents moving smoothly through their corridors. The railroad doesn't want a case that raises questions about what their agents represent to property owners. That opens every contract they've ever signed to scrutiny." He folded his hands on the desk. What they want is this property's river pasture easement. What they don't want is a precedent. Then we make it more expensive to push than to settle, Margaret said. That is precisely the strategy, yes. Whitfield looked at her again, with the expression of a man revising something upward. Mrs. Rourke, did you tell Aldridge you intended to file an injunction? I suggested we were prepared to. And his response? He agreed to wait until Friday. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He agreed to wait until Friday, he repeated. Yes. Based on your representation that you would file. Based on my representation that we were prepared to. Prepared to, Whitfield said carefully. That's a meaningful distinction. I was aware of that when I said it. Whitfield looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at him, with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by his wife approximately 48 hours ago, and had decided to simply pay attention instead. Your retainer is $400, Whitfield said. I'll take $300 now, and the remainder when this is resolved. Given the documentation request strategy, I believe we can bring Aldridge to a settlement conversation within 60 days. The settlement I'll push for is a formal nullification of the easement clause in exchange for dropping the misrepresentation claim. He paused. He will not like that. He doesn't have to like it, Margaret said. Whitfield picked up his pen and opened his ledger. No, he said. He doesn't. They were on the road back from Deadwood by early afternoon, the wagon moving south through country that felt different to Margaret than it had on the way up. Charged with something. Not relief exactly, because nothing was resolved, but the specific tension of a fight that had been properly joined rather than endured. Samuel drove with his usual economy of movement and was quiet for the first hour in the way she had learned meant he was thinking rather than retreating. $300, he said finally. We have 100 left, plus what the stallion can be sold for if necessary. I don't want to sell the stallion. I know. We may not have to. She watched the road. Whitfield's right about the precedent problem. Aldridge won't want a formal hearing any more than we do. You sound certain. I sound like I'm working with the information I have. She glanced at him. There's a difference between certainty and calculated confidence. Certainty is what people perform when they're afraid. Confidence is what you use when you've looked at the problem straight. He was quiet again. Then, where did you learn to think like that? My father. She said it simply, without the complicated weight the word usually carried, which meant she was talking about something she had made her peace with. He used to say that most people spent their lives being afraid of the wrong things because they hadn't looked carefully at the right things. He was a doctor. He said fear was useful when it pointed you toward the actual danger, and useless when it pointed you away from it. He sounds like a clear-thinking man. He was. He died of typhoid when I was 21. A pause. He had treated typhoid patients for 30 years and believed he had become immune through exposure. He was wrong. She said it without bitterness, just as the plain fact it had been for 5 years. He was a clear-thinking man who had one blind spot, and it killed him. Most people are some version of that. What's your blind spot? Samuel asked. She considered that. It was not a question people usually asked directly, which meant most people either didn't want to know or didn't trust that the answer would be honest. I trust logic over instinct longer than I should sometimes, she said finally. I can look at a situation, work out what's rational, and stay with the rational interpretation even when something underneath it is telling me the situation isn't rational. She paused. Daniel's brother Edmund. I knew, on some level I knew, that his friendship in those first months after the funeral was not friendship. But I told myself it was illogical to be suspicious of a grieving man, and I didn't listen to what I knew until it was too late. You won't make that mistake again. No. She turned slightly to look at him. What's yours? He didn't answer immediately, and she let the silence run because she had asked him a real question, and real questions deserved the consideration they required. The horses moved steadily, the wagon wheels finding the ruts in the road with the weary familiarity of horses that had made this trip many times. I hold on too long, he said at last, to situations that aren't working. I tell myself I can fix something if I just keep working at it. The ranch, the first 3 years. I should have taken on a partner, had help, let someone share the weight. I didn't because I thought needing help meant something was wrong with me. He paused. I did the same thing with this railroad contract. I knew something was off when I signed it. I felt it. But I told myself I was reading too much into it, that it was just standard paperwork, that asking questions would make me look ignorant. Pride, she said. Yes, he said it plainly. The kind that masquerades as self-sufficiency. My father had that too, Margaret said. He called it independence. It amounts to the same thing in the end. The wagon crested a rise, and the ranch came into view below them in the late afternoon light. The house and barn solid and low against the hillside. Smoke from the chimney that meant Brendan was home, and the river pasture catching the last of the sunlight with the brilliant particular green of good grassland in late spring. Margaret looked at it and thought about how it had looked from this same rise on her first day, when she had been trying to decide what she was riding toward. It looked different now. Not the landscape, that was unchanged, but the way she held it in her mind. It was hers in a way that it had not been 3 days ago. Not because she had claimed it, but because she had begun to understand what it cost to keep it, and had decided the cost was worth paying. They were halfway down the track to the house when Brendan came out of the barn at a pace that was not his usual easy amble. He was moving with the directional urgency of someone carrying bad news and trying to decide how to deliver it, which Margaret had seen enough times in hospital corridors to recognize before he'd said a word. Samuel pulled the horses up. What? Aldridge came back, Brendan said. He was breathing slightly fast. This morning, about an hour after you left. He had 4 men with him this time, not 2. They went straight to the river pasture. He looked at his brother. I told them you'd said to wait. Aldridge said the survey schedule was set by the railroad and not subject to your request. He paused. I told them they were trespassing. One of the men laughed. Samuel was off the wagon before Margaret could say anything. She climbed down herself and followed him toward the barn, where he was already saddling his horse with the fast, controlled movements of a man managing anger rather than acting from it. They're still there? She asked Brendan. They were when I came up to watch for you. How many hours ago? About 3. I don't know if they're still there or if they went to file whatever they were measuring. If they're still there, they're trying to establish presence, Margaret said. Physical survey activity on record before Whitfield can file the challenge. She turned to Samuel. Don't go down there and confront them. He looked at her over the horse's back. His expression was the flattest she had seen it, which meant the anger was at its highest, controlled but present. They're in my pasture, he said. I know, and riding down there and telling them to leave gives Aldridge exactly what he wants. A confrontation he can use to paint you as obstructionist, uncooperative, someone whose property claim is complicated by behavioral issues. She held his gaze. Let them survey. Let them write down whatever they're measuring. None of it matters once Whitfield files the challenge, because everything done after that point, under a contested contract, is done at the railroad's risk, not yours. You're asking me to watch them walk on my land and do nothing. I'm asking you to let me write a letter instead. He stared at her. A letter to Aldridge, dated today, hand-delivered to his office in Millhaven tomorrow, formally notifying him that as of this date we are in receipt of legal counsel and that any survey activity conducted on this property, prior to the resolution of the challenge to be filed with the territorial court this week, is conducted at the railroad's sole liability. She kept her voice level. It's not a threat, it's a fact, but a fact on paper, delivered formally, changes what Aldridge can tell his superiors about how this situation is developing. The silence stretched between them. Outside the barn, the late afternoon light was doing what it did every day, without regard for the human decisions being made beneath it. And the river pasture was 200 yards away, with strangers in it. And Samuel Rourke was a man who had built everything he had with his hands and his back, and his willingness to do whatever needed doing himself. And standing still, while someone walked on his land, was about the hardest thing she could have asked of him. "He won't take it seriously," Samuel said, but the fight in his voice had changed quality. "He'll take it seriously enough to send it to his legal department. And his legal department will tell him that a formally noticed dispute changes the risk profile of continuing the survey. They won't stop immediately, but they'll slow down." She paused. "Samuel, the letter is a weapon. Writing down there is a grievance. We need weapons right now, not grievances." He stood for a long moment with his hand on the horse's neck. Then he put the saddle back on its rack. "Brendan," he said, without turning around, "get Margaret paper and ink from the desk." Brendan, who had been standing at the barn door during the whole exchange with the expression of someone watching something they were not entirely sure they were understanding, disappeared into the house at a pace that suggested he had no intention of being the reason for delay. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter in 20 minutes, drafting it twice on scratch paper first because the language mattered, each word carrying the specific weight she intended it to carry. Samuel stood at the window and watched the direction of the river pasture. He did not pace. She had noticed that about him. He was still when he was waiting, where a different man would have made the room feel smaller with movement. When she finished the final copy, she read it aloud to him. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "The phrase sole and irrevocable liability. You mean that?" "I mean that if they continue surveying under a contested contract and the challenge succeeds, everything they've documented is inadmissible, and they've wasted their own time and money. Yes." Whitfield didn't tell us to write this. Whitfield told us to file a challenge. He didn't tell us we couldn't also protect the interim period. She set the letter on the table. "This is within the scope of what an informed party to a disputed contract can legitimately do. I'm not inventing law. I'm using what's available." He looked at the letter for a long moment. "You're certain?" "Calculated confidence," she said. Something shifted in his face, the hardness of the last hour easing by a degree. Not gone, but redistributed, the way a man shifted a heavy load from the grip that was killing him to the one he could manage longer. He picked up the letter, read it himself, slowly, the careful, deliberate reading of a man who had been careless once about paper and had learned from it. He set it down. "Brendan," he called. Brendan appeared in the doorway. "Yeah? You're riding to Millhaven first thing tomorrow. You'll deliver this to Aldridge's office directly, to his hand if he's there, to the office manager if he's not. You'll get a signature acknowledging receipt." He looked at his brother steadily. "Can you do that without getting into a card game or a fight or any other situation that requires my attention?" Brendan held his brother's gaze. It was the longest he had held it since Margaret had arrived, and something passed between them in that sustained look. Not resolution. They were not at resolution yet, but the first honest engagement of an argument that had been circling them both for a long time. "Yes," Brendan said. "I can do that." The survey team left the river pasture before sunset, which they knew because Brendan rode down to check and came back to report it with more seriousness of purpose than Margaret had yet seen from him. Whether Aldridge had told them to conclude for the day, or whether the approaching dark had simply ended their work, She didn't know. It didn't matter for tonight. What mattered for tonight was supper, which Margaret made from the provisions she had organized that morning, and the conversation that happened around the table while the three of them ate, which was different from the conversation at the first supper 2 nights ago. That first supper had been the conversation of people being careful with each other. This was the conversation of people who had been through something together in the space of 48 hours and had come out the other side, still in the same room. Brendan told them about his time in Deadwood. Not the version he had told Samuel before, the managed version, the one where Brendan was mostly a victim of circumstance, but something closer to the actual version. The one where he had known he was making bad decisions and kept making them, because being away from the ranch and away from Samuel's steady, unspoken expectation had felt, briefly and expensively, like freedom. "I knew what I was doing," Brendan said, to his plate rather than to either of them. "I knew it was Sam's money. I told myself it was a loan, that I'd win it back. And then when I didn't, I told myself the same thing again." He looked up at Samuel. "I'm sorry for it. I've said that. I mean it more than I said it." "I know you do," Samuel said. "I'm going to pay it back." He said it with the careful precision of someone making a commitment they intended to mean. "All of it. Not just the cash. The time it cost you. I'll make it up." "You'll start by writing to Millhaven tomorrow and delivering that letter without incident," Samuel said. "Then we'll talk about the rest." Brendan nodded. He looked at Margaret. "You figured out how to fight the railroad in about 2 days." "I had the contract in front of me and time to think," she said. "Your brother had been carrying it alone for 8 months." "Yeah," Brendan turned his cup in his hands. "He does that. Carries things alone." He glanced at Samuel, and there was something in it that was more than the usual fraternal static. Something that had been waiting for a space to be said, and had finally found one. "I knew it was a problem. The Aldridge thing. I could see it eating at him. I didn't know how to help with it, and I was afraid if I tried and made it worse, He stopped. "He'd what?" Margaret asked. "He'd finally decide I wasn't worth keeping around." Brendan said it quietly. I know I caused him problems. I cause him problems regular. But the ranch is the only home I've got, and he's the only family I've got. And sometimes I think he's about a year from deciding the trouble I bring outweighs the use." He looked at Samuel directly. "Is he?" The table was very quiet. Samuel set down his fork. He looked at his younger brother with the full attention of a man who chose his words like tools, selecting the right one for the specific job rather than reaching for whatever was closest. "No," he said. "He's not." Brendan exhaled something he had probably been holding for longer than tonight. "But things are going to be different," Samuel said. "Not because I'm threatening to leave you behind. Because you're 24 years old, and I've been cleaning up after you since you were 16, and that's not good for either one of us." He paused. "You want to pay back what you owe? Stop making me catch you every time you fall. I'll be here when you land. That's not the same thing." It was almost exactly what Margaret had said to him in the apothecary workroom 2 days and a marriage ago. He had been listening then. He had been listening since. Brendan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, all right." Another pause. "The letter tomorrow. I'll handle it." "I know you will," Samuel said. After supper, Brendan washed the dishes without being asked, which Margaret thought was worth noting and chose not to comment on. Because sometimes the best thing you could do for a person's dignity was let them do the right thing without making a ceremony of it. She was sitting by the fireplace going over the notes she'd made from Whitfield's meeting when Samuel came and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together in the way they had been quiet together in the apothecary and on the wagon road, and in all the spaces between the difficult conversations. A quiet that had started out as the careful silence of strangers and had become, in a very short time, the comfortable silence of people who had decided they could trust each other with the truth. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, and she knew he meant it simply, not as preamble to something else, but as genuine inquiry. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "Better than I expected to be," she said. "I don't mean that as a low bar. I mean that 3 days ago, I was sitting on a platform in Millhaven, calculating how long my money would last. And now I'm sitting in a house in Dakota Territory, with a contract fight and a complicated family situation, and the beginnings of something I didn't know I was still capable of." She looked at the fire. "That's a considerable change in 3 days." "For both of us," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Are you sorry? That it happened fast? That you didn't take more time to—" "No." He said it without hesitation, the same tone he had used saying his vows, the tone of a man who had reached his answer before the question finished being asked. "I was alone for 6 years. I know what that costs. I don't want to be careful to the point of waste." She thought about that for a moment. Then she set down her notes and looked at him. Really looked, the way she had been looking since the first moment in the apothecary doorway, cataloging the specific truth of him rather than the impression of him. The gray in his hair that he wore without apology. The hands that had built this house and knew how to hold a horse and how to hold a letter he had carried 60 miles, and how to be still when stillness was what was needed. The scar along his jaw from something he hadn't mentioned yet, which she would ask about eventually, because she intended to know everything eventually. She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand over his. He turned his hand under hers and held it. "We'll hold the land," she said. It was not a promise she could make with certainty, and he knew that. And she said it anyway, because some things needed to be said in the direction of the future, even when the future wasn't guaranteed. "Whitfield is good. The strategy is sound, and Aldridge does not yet fully understand what he is dealing with." Samuel's hand tightened on hers. "No," he said, "he doesn't." Outside the ranch, the Dakota night was doing what it always did, expanding in every direction until the stars were the only measure of its size. And inside the house that was hers now in every sense that mattered, Margaret Rourke sat with her husband's hand in hers and thought about her father telling her to look at the actual danger, not the imagined one, and thought that for the first time in a long time, she had. Brendan rode to Millhaven at dawn and came back by midday with a signed receipt and the information that Aldridge had been in his office when the letter arrived, had read it in front of Brendan without speaking, and had then asked, with careful pleasantness, whether Mrs. Rourke had written it herself. Brendan had said yes. Aldridge had said nothing further, which Brendan reported with the particular satisfaction of someone who had done a thing correctly and knew it. Margaret took the receipt and filed it with the contract and the survey notice in the leather folder she had designated for everything related to the railroad, which was sitting on the shelf above the desk with the deliberate visibility of something that was not going to be forgotten or misplaced. Samuel watched her file it and said nothing, which was his version of approval, and she had learned to read it as such. The following days settled into a rhythm that was not the rhythm of waiting, which Margaret had had enough of on that Millhaven platform to last her the rest of her life, but the rhythm of work that had direction. She rose before full light and went through the medical bag her father had left her with, the same attention she had given it every morning since Cincinnati, inventorying what she had and what she needed, and making a list that grew longer as she understood more about what a ranch in Dakota Territory actually required in the way of medical supplies. Carbolic acid, more bandaging cloth, laudanum in controlled quantity, a proper suturing kit to replace the one she had been improvising from since Daniel died. She also began to learn the ranch in the specific way that only came from doing, not from being told. Samuel showed her things once and trusted her to do them afterward, which was the right approach and which she appreciated more than she said, because being told things twice was a form of not being believed the first time. She learned to read the mares the way he read them, which ones were nervous and which were simply spirited, which ones needed handling that was slow and which needed the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. She was not good at it yet, not the way Samuel was good at it, but she was learning at the pace of someone who paid attention, and paying attention was something she was constitutionally equipped for. Brendan was different in ways that were not dramatic but were real. He was on time for things. He finished what he started before moving to the next task. He stopped disappearing in the afternoons for reasons that were never quite explained, and started being findable when he was needed. None of it was announced or performed. It was simply the behavior of someone who had said a thing at a table and was in the early stages of finding out whether he meant it. Margaret did not praise him for it. She treated it as baseline, which she had decided was the right approach, to respond to his improved behavior the way she would respond to any adult who was doing what was expected, rather than making an event of each instance. She thought Samuel agreed with this, though they hadn't discussed it directly, because she had watched him apply the same approach, accepting Brendan's contributions without comment, except in the practical sense of building the next task on top of the completed one. 2 weeks after the letter was delivered, Whitfield sent a message through the Millhaven Telegraph. The challenge had been filed. The railroad's Yankton legal office had acknowledged receipt. Survey activity on the disputed property was formally paused, pending review. Samuel read the telegram at the kitchen table with the same stillness he brought to everything and set it down. "It worked," Brendan said. "The challenge worked," Margaret said. "The fight isn't over." "But Aldridge has to respond formally now," Samuel said. "He can't just move men through the pasture and present it as done." "No." She poured coffee and set his cup in front of him. "Whitfield thinks the documentation request will produce something useful. Aldridge's authorization papers, the internal instructions about what agents could represent to property owners. If those instructions limited what he was allowed to promise, and he promised more than that anyway, the railroad has a problem that's bigger than our contract." "How much bigger?" Brendan asked. "Potentially every contract he signed in this territory." She sat down across from Samuel. "Which is why I think they'll settle before it gets that far." Samuel looked at her over his coffee cup. "You've thought this through from their side." "My father used to say you couldn't solve a problem you only understood from one direction." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Aldridge is not the railroad. He's an agent with his own interests, which include keeping his job. If the documentation request exposes that he exceeded his authorization, the railroad's best option is to settle our case quietly and dismiss him. That removes the liability without acknowledging the broader pattern." "So they sacrifice him," Brendan said. "If they're smart about it, yes." She paused. "Which is why Whitfield is also sending a separate, private communication to Aldridge personally, suggesting that his own interests might be best served by facilitating a quiet settlement rather than forcing documentation that could expose his authorization limits." Both men looked at her. "You told Whitfield to do that?" Samuel asked. "I suggested it when I wrote to him Tuesday. He agreed it was sound." She met Samuel's eyes. "Aldridge isn't our enemy. He's a man doing a job badly and covering it with good manners. If we give him a way to end this that doesn't destroy him completely, he'll take it faster than if we back him into a corner." Samuel set down his cup. "You're giving him a way out." I'm giving him the way out that happens to be our way out, too. She held his gaze. That's not mercy. That's efficiency. Something moved across Samuel's face that she had been seeing with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks. Something that was past surprise and into the territory of a deeper recognition. The look of a man who was still in the process of understanding who he had married and finding the answer consistently larger than his original estimate. He picked up his cup again and drank his coffee and did not say anything else about it, which was his way. 3 weeks after the challenge was filed, on a Tuesday morning, when Margaret was in the yard with the medical bag, tending to a mare who had cut her fetlock on loose wire, and Samuel was in the north pasture with Brendan checking fences, Helen Cross rode up the track from the Millhaven Road on a sturdy gray horse with a saddlebag over her arm, and the expression of a woman who had been thinking about making this trip for a while, and had finally decided to stop thinking and make it. Margaret looked up from the mare's leg. "Helen." "Margaret?" Helen dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been riding these roads for 20 years. She looked at the bandaging work. "Clean wrap, good tension." "I learned from watching my father." "You learned from watching, period. That's rarer than it should be." Helen handed her horse's reins to a post and opened her saddlebag. "I brought you supplies. Carbolic, suturing silk, morphine sulfate in controlled measure." I wrote down the dispensing protocol. She produced a wrapped package and held it out. "Consider it a wedding gift. 3 weeks late." Margaret took the package and felt the specific weight of the things she had needed and not yet been able to get. "Thank you, Helen." "Don't thank me. The territory needs people who can do this work, and the nearest doctor is 2 days south, and I can't ride these roads forever." Helen looked at her directly. "I want to talk to you about something." They sat on the porch while the mare grazed peacefully in the yard with her bandaged leg, and Helen Cross told Margaret about the idea she had been carrying since the afternoon Margaret had walked out of the apothecary in the direction of the Justice of the Peace. There were 3 ranching families within 15 miles of Helen's apothecary who had no medical access beyond what she could provide, and she was 61 years old, and her knees were not improving. What she was proposing was not a formal arrangement. The territory had no mechanism for formalizing it anyway, but a practical one. Margaret would make a circuit once a month, longer if needed. Helen would provide supplies at cost. The families would pay what they could, which would not be much, but would be something. "I'm not a licensed physician," Margaret said. "No, you're better than most of what we've got available." Helen folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not asking you to do surgery. I'm asking you to do what your father trained you to do. Look at people carefully and tell them the truth about what you see." Margaret thought about the ward in Cincinnati, the 2 years of dressing wounds and managing fevers, and watching her father move through patients with a specific, unhurried attention of a man who understood that being looked at carefully was itself a form of treatment. She thought about what she had said to Samuel in the apothecary workroom, 11 days and a marriage and a railroad fight ago, about needing work that mattered and a life at full size. "I'll talk to Samuel," she said. "Of course." Helen paused. "He'll say yes. He's not a man who diminishes the people around him." "No," Margaret agreed. "He's not." Samuel said yes that evening without hesitation, and then asked 3 practical questions about the circuit route and whether she would need a better horse than Bessie for the longer distances, which was Samuel Rourke's way of engaging with a thing he had already decided to support. "Bessie's fine for the shorter runs," Margaret said. "For the Greer property and the Halverson place, I'd want something with more endurance. There's a bay gelding in the north pasture I've been intending to work. He's got better ground covering strive than Bessie." He looked at her. "I'll have him ready by the time you need him." "You're not going to ask me if I'm sure about this." "Are you sure about it?" "Yes." "Then I don't need to ask. He picked up his fork and returned to his supper with the equanimity of a man who had stopped performing doubt about his wife's judgment approximately 2 weeks into knowing her. The settlement offer came 41 days after Whitfield filed the challenge, delivered to his Deadwood office by a Union Pacific attorney from the Omaha headquarters, which told Margaret that the documentation request had produced exactly what she had predicted it would produce. Something expensive enough that Omaha had decided to step over Aldridge entirely and manage the situation from above. The offer was a full nullification of the easement clause, formal written acknowledgement that the adjacency language had been misrepresented at time of signing, and a payment of $300 to cover legal costs. Whitfield sent a message recommending they accept. Margaret read the message, and then read the settlement terms, and then did the arithmetic that she did with everything, looking at it from all sides, checking for the places where the language turned complicated or soft. "It's clean," she told Samuel. "The nullification is permanent and documented with the territorial court. The acknowledgement creates a record that protects the property against any future claim using the same contract language." She set the paper down, and the $300 covers Whitfield almost exactly. "Meaning the whole fight cost us nothing except time?" Samuel said. "And the time was worth spending." She looked at him. "Take the settlement." He signed the acceptance papers the next morning, and Margaret witnessed it. And the river pasture was theirs, the way it had always been theirs, in fact, now confirmed in the only additional way that mattered. On paper, in the territorial record, beyond convenient reinterpretation. Aldridge was not mentioned in the settlement. She didn't ask what had happened to him because it wasn't her business, and because she had said at the beginning that he wasn't their enemy, and she had meant it then, and still meant it now. It was Helen who told her, 3 weeks later on the first circuit run, that Aldridge had been reassigned to the railroad's Missouri office. Not fired, reassigned. Which was, Margaret thought, about what she had predicted. The circuit that first month took her to 4 families over 2 days, riding the bay gelding Samuel had prepared with the sure-footed confidence of a horse that had been properly handled. She dressed a wound that had been improperly tended and was beginning to show the early signs of infection that, caught now, would not become the thing it would have become untreated. She diagnosed a child's recurring fever as a water source problem and told the family what to do about it, and wrote down the instructions so they wouldn't have to rely on memory. She sat with a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy who had not seen another woman in 6 weeks, and talked with her for 2 hours about things that mattered and things that didn't. Because sometimes what a person needed most from someone with medical training was the confirmation that they were not alone in their body and their fear. When she rode back into the ranch yard on the second evening, Samuel was at the corral fence, watching for her in the way she had come to recognize. Not anxiously, not performing patience, simply present, oriented in her direction. The way a man stood when someone he cared about was coming home. She unsaddled the gelding and rubbed him down and gave him water. And then she went to where Samuel was waiting and told him about the 4 families and the infected wound and the fever and the woman in her 8th month. And he listened to all of it with the full attention he gave things that mattered to her, which was the same attention he gave to things that mattered to the ranch, which was the same attention he had given to her letters 14 times before he had ever seen her face. "The woman near the Halverson place," Margaret said. "She's going to need someone there when the baby comes. Her husband is a good man, but he's never attended a birth, and she's frightened." She looked at Samuel steadily. "I'll need to go and stay when the time is close, possibly for several days." "Tell me when, and I'll manage the ranch." "Brendan will need to step up." "Brendan stepped up this week without being asked." Samuel's voice was matter-of-fact, not generous or cautious about it, just honest. "He's been different since the table conversation. I think he needed to hear some things said directly. He needed to hear that he wasn't being managed out," Margaret said. That's different from being praised for improvement. One is a threat removed. The other is a standard met. You know a great deal about how people work. I know what I've observed. She paused. I was afraid I'd made a mistake with Brendan. Coming in and saying the things I said so early. You didn't. I know that now, but in the moment, she stopped. In the moment, I wasn't certain. I was working from the calculated confidence side of things again. Samuel looked at her, and the look was the one she had been cataloging since the apothecary workroom. The one that had been growing in detail and depth over the weeks. The one that contained in it all of the specific things he had observed about her and decided were worth the deliberate and unhurried act of his full attention. She had learned to hold that look without deflecting it, which had taken longer than she expected and mattered more than she could have predicted. Your calculated confidence, he said, saved the river pasture. Our calculated confidence, she said. You're the one who had the sense to listen to it. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, the same gesture he had made in the first weeks, brief and unhurried, the gesture of a man who was not performing tenderness, but simply expressing it in the understated way of someone who had been careful with his words for so long that his hands had learned to say the things his voice took longer to reach. Come inside, he said. Brendan made supper. She laughed, which still surprised her when it happened. The way laughter arrived at the ranch like weather, not manufactured but real, coming up from the specific ground of actual things. Brendan made supper. He's been practicing. It's edible. Mostly. They walked inside together, and the house that had been a bachelor's shelter 6 weeks ago, and a stranger's territory 5 weeks ago, was neither of those things now. It was the place that held them. The medical bag on the dresser, and Samuel's coat on the hook by the door, and the patient ledger on the desk, and the leather folder with the settled railroad contract filed in it, and done with. And the curtains Margaret had hung on the east window last week, that caught the morning light, the way she had known they would. And the chair by the fireplace, where she sat in the evenings when the work was done, close enough to Samuel's chair that their conversation was easy, far enough that she still had the room to be herself that she had required from the beginning, and which he had given her without being asked, because he had understood from the letters that it was not a negotiable thing. Brendan had made a serviceable beef stew and was obviously waiting for someone to notice, which Margaret did, by eating 2 portions and saying nothing about it, which was exactly the right response. And Brendan's expression settled in the way it did when he was not being made a performance of. After supper, after the dishes, after Brendan had gone to the bunkroom that had been built for a ranch hand who had never materialized, and which now housed a 24-year-old who was in the slow process of becoming someone worth the space he took up, Margaret sat at the desk and wrote the notes from the circuit. The infected wound and the treatment plan. The fever and the water source and the instructions she had given. The pregnant woman's name and approximate due date, and the specific signs that would mean she needed to go early. Samuel sat in his chair by the fire and read, and the house was quiet around them, in the particular way it was quiet, when it was not empty, but full. She finished her notes and set down her pen and looked at the window, where the Dakota night was doing its usual vast and indifferent business with the stars, and thought about the woman in Millhaven who had sat on a platform for 4 days with $14 and a trunk full of everything she owned, and a letter she had torn into pieces because she had decided in that specific moment of exhaustion and fury that she was done. She had not been done. She had been, it turned out, just beginning. Samuel, she said. He looked up from his book. I need to tell you something. She turned in the chair to face him fully. I've been thinking about how to say it for a few days, and I've decided that the thinking is the obstacle. So I'm going to say it the plain way. She held his gaze across the width of the room, across the firelight, across the specific distance of a man and a woman who had come to each other late and by an unlikely road, and had built something in a very short time that felt, to her, like the most real thing she had ever been part of. I love you. I know it's been 6 weeks. I know that's fast by most reasonable measures. But I have been paying careful attention for 6 weeks, and everything I've seen has pointed in the same direction. And I trust careful attention more than I trust timelines. Samuel set his book down. He did it without looking at it, his eyes staying on her face. And then he stood up and crossed the room, and he crouched down in front of her chair, the way a man did when he wanted to be at the same level as the person he was speaking to. And he took her hands in his. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for 3 weeks. I've been waiting to tell you because I didn't want to rush what you needed to find on your own terms." He held her hands carefully, the scarred and calloused hands of a man who had built everything he had, and who was holding something now that he understood, in the deep way of a person who had lost before, was not guaranteed, and was all the more valuable for that. "I love you, Margaret. I have since about the 3rd day, which was unreasonable, and I knew it was unreasonable. But it was true anyway." "The 3rd day," she said. "The day you wrote the letter to Aldridge and called it a weapon instead of an apology." The corner of his mouth moved. "I thought, this is a woman who is going to make everything harder and better at the same time for the rest of my life." And I thought that sounded exactly right. She leaned forward and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the same deliberate, unhurried quality he brought to everything that mattered. And outside the window, the Dakota Territory continued its enormous, indifferent existence, unimpressed by human love, as it was unimpressed by everything, which was the right context for it. Love that needed the endorsement of the landscape was love that hadn't yet found its own ground to stand on. Theirs had found its ground. In the months that followed, the ranch grew in the specific way that things grew when two people with different and complementary capabilities worked toward the same ends without one diminishing the other. The breeding program expanded because Margaret had suggested, after reading 3 months of Whitfield's land records during the settlement process, that 2 adjacent parcels to the north were likely to come available within a year, and that acquiring them before the railroad's next expansion push would double the available grazing land. Samuel had listened and begun the acquisition conversations before spring. The circuit runs became a fixture of the 2nd month and the 3rd, and by autumn, Margaret had attended 2 births and managed 4 cases of serious illness, and earned the specific trust of people who gave trust carefully because they had learned that the territory did not forgive mistakes about who you relied on. Helen Cross rode out to the ranch in October and sat on the porch and told Margaret that she had been right, that this was what the territory needed, and that she intended to leave the apothecary to Margaret in her will, which Margaret told her was premature. "I'm 61 and my knees are going," Helen said. "Nothing is premature." Brendan, by November, had paid back 2/3 of what he owed through work rather than cash, which Samuel tracked without comment, and which Margaret understood was Samuel's way of making sure the debt was real and the repayment was real without making it punitive. He had stopped disappearing. He had started finishing things. He was not yet the man he would eventually become, but he was moving in the right direction, at a pace he had chosen himself, which was the only pace that stuck. On the 1st anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Millhaven, not the marriage, but the arrival, the day she had stepped off the Yankton stage into a town that did not know her, with $14 and a medical bag and a set of terms she had not yet had the chance to state, Samuel asked her to ride with him to the river pasture. They stood at the edge of the grass in the October morning, the mares grazing in the distance where they were always meant to graze, the river running clear and cold the way Samuel had described it in his letters. And Samuel turned to look at her, with the full attention he had given her since the first moment in the apothecary doorway. "A year," he said. "A year," she agreed. "Are you sorry for any of it?" She looked at the pasture that was theirs, fully and legally and finally, and at the ranch beyond it that she had learned room by room and acre by acre, and at the man beside her who had ridden 60 miles with a white handkerchief and told her the truth about everything, including the things that made him look bad, and who had given her the full-size life she had come looking for, without requiring her to be smaller to fit inside it. "I'm sorry for 4 days of Gerald Pratt's desk drawer," she said. "Everything else I'd keep exactly as it was." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the river pasture spread before them in the October light, and the mountains held the horizon, and the territory was vast and cold and indifferent and entirely, permanently, theirs. Some women waited for rescue. Margaret Colwell had waited for a partner, had insisted on finding one, had refused to leave until she had assessed the situation with the careful attention her father had taught her, and determined that what was in front of her was real. She had been right. She had known she was right by the 3rd day and stayed anyway. Not because she had no choice, but because staying was the choice that pointed toward the life she had come for. She had arrived with $14 and a medical bag and a list of non-negotiable terms. And she had built a home and a partnership and a practice and a future from all of it, one honest day at a time, in the only way anything real was ever built, by looking at it straight, calling it what it was, and refusing to let go.